like to welcome you to this discussion between myself, my name is Steve Hayes, and my good friend here, David Sloan Wilson. And together we've edited this volume that's examining the reunification of evolution and contextual behavioral science perspectives in a series of paired chapters looking at several different topics. And we thought it would be good for us to look at an overall view of this volume and the importance of this dialogue in this final concluding discussion. So David, good to see you again, my friend, and I'm glad to be able
Always good. We're going to have a lot of fun, as always.
Yes. We thought it might be a good place to start, just to talk about our own history just a little bit, not the detailed biographical part, but just the intellectual part of where we were coming from, and then how we sort of come together in pursuing this topic over a period of years. And perhaps, David, you could start.
Sure. So very quickly, I've studied evolution and human affairs inside the ivory tower throughout my career, but about 10 years ago, I decided to take it outside the ivory tower and to see how this theory could be used in the real world. And pretty quickly, I came into contact with folks like you, starting out with Tony Biglin, our friend Tony Biglin, who introduced me to you and others. And so that was the beginning of my own reunification. At the time, I knew very little about contextual behavioral science, and what I thought I knew, especially about major figures such as B.F. Skinner, was really all wrong. And so it was through my relationship with you and others that I learned a lot about contextual behavioral science. And it was very, very important reunification as far as my own thinking was concerned. And this volume is an effort to do for our respective fields what I think has taken place in our own minds. And then maybe you could fill in your side of that.
Yeah, I'll start with something that might startle people a little bit. I shared it with you, David. When our relationship began to emerge, I think I shared with you, I literally went home and cried because the feeling of a behavioral psychologist who, deeply values evolutionary thinking and thinks of their own work in that way, coexisting with this disconnection, not just a disconnection, but almost an open hostility, well, maybe not hostility, but dismissal that has been there historically. You mentioned Skinner, and I'm probably a neo-Skinnerian. I mean, many of my ideas probably he wouldn't agree with if he was still alive, but he was an intellectual hero and a focus of my early training. And knowing that as I did, I thought of him as an evolutionary psychologist. He thought of himself that way and wrote repeatedly about the similarity between selection within the lifetime of an individual, the focus of his work, and within cultures and genetically across the lifetime of individuals in other work. But that analogy had been firmly rejected as, on the one hand, a life and death issue, and on the other hand, a kind of development and strengthening issue, and that it was considered to be a loose metaphor, loose to the point of distortion. And so if you had to pick a list of topics as to why behavioral psychology was sort of moved out of the mainstream, there would be two big ones. One would be the difficulty with language and cognition. And the second one was its implausibility evolutionarily. And so the reunification that we're exploring here is one that is sort of profoundly important, I think, to the behavioral science tradition, who thinks of itself in functional and contextual ways, and as behavioral science embedded under the umbrella of evolution science, as the contextual behavioral scientists certainly do. But then learning how to do that, and do that in a way that's more sophisticated, and really deals with the grit and grain of what has happened in evolution science, which has progressed so amazingly fast, part due to persons like yourself and the people who are authors on these chapters in this book. That's a different matter, and that's one that I think the entire field is beginning to warm to and be excited by.
Yeah, I think that's right. I cannot improve upon that. We can, the first chapter, introductory chapter to the book, is going to go in a little bit more detail as to what the word reunification means, which is basically that contextual behavioral science started out evolutionary, starting out with the philosophical tradition of pragmatism. And among other things, this is a philosophy of doing science, basically, science in the context of everyday life, which is, I think, something distinctive about contextual behavioral science, quite apart from the Skinnerian connection and so on, which is important to bring out. I think we will bring it's brought out throughout, but we'll also bring it out in this conversation. Then the Skinnerian tradition is something which was evolutionary in his own mind. Its rejection in academic psychology. What for me is a bizarre turn of events, which is the emergence of evolutionary psychology as something which strongly rejected the so-called standard social science model. And then, so really, that only now being healed in a sense. It really is a healing process. When people talk about it, when you just talked about it, there's all sorts of wounds that need to be healed. That's how it is. It's not an arid intellectual a topic, is it?
No, I think it's a profound one. I think people are emotional about it because they sense the importance of it. And the other part is this issue of history. I consider myself really to have two primary mentors in my life intellectually, and through their mentors and their mentors and their mentors, I both of them trace back to the Chicago School, Dewey, and then James. And so and James himself, I mean, pragmatism itself is in part a response to Darwin and an attempt to try to square the circle of what does that imply, and then applying it to the behavior of scientists themselves and viewing science itself as an issue of variation and selection, of adaptation.
So here's what I think is an important similarity and difference, which we'll can get to. This is also a reflection on the chapters and the dialogues. Evolution, of course, evolutionary biology is richly contextual. You can't understand any species except in relation to its environment. So contextualism is baked into the DNA of evolutionary biology, but mostly with respect to genetic evolution. And contextual behavioral science emphasizes context, but mostly with respect to behavioral flexibility, that you can't, not genetic evolution. And so they're both contextual in their own way, but at different scales, basically. And when we brought these authors together, in many cases, that similarity and difference revealed itself. So the evolutionists were often talking about the products of genetic evolution, which we would understand and they would understand as a sort of a closed form of phenotypic plasticity. For example, people in harsh environments are programmed to develop a fast life history strategy, as opposed to people that grow up in nurturing environments that are programmed by genetic evolution to develop a slow life history strategy. And then the CBS people would say, no matter who walks through our door, which is typically someone who grew up in a harsh environment, otherwise we wouldn't be seeing them. Now what do we do to make them more flexible? And so this is like part of the, in part, disciplinary difference that accounts for some of these differences.
It is, I think, a difference in terms of level of analysis. And you can understand that both the uh, plausibility of reunification, which I think you can see in these chapters over and over again. You see these Venn diagrams with an amazing amount, because people need to understand these chapters were not only written by different teams, they were written with no specification of what they would write about other than the generic area. So there was no attempt to make sure that you're talking about things that would overlap or that would be different. You could pick anything in the area of, you go through it, emotion or small groups, etc. And then here are these chapters, which over and over again, here's a Venn diagram, and they overlap in very significant ways, and yet they're different. And if you were to back up and look at the state of behavioral science and evolutionary science some decades ago, I don't think we could do this. I think part of what's happened, the differences I do think do come from levels, but part of what's happened is there's been some changes in the two fields. If you look at the behavioral science side, I often note that the early research work of people, like Watson and Skinner and so forth, was more like psychobiology. You go back and look at what they were actually writing about, and there were species-specific differences. People forget that comparative psychology and that whole issue of species-specific differences and so forth was very dominant, especially in the animal learning traditions from which the behavioral science wing we're talking about came from. But there wasn't a good language for how to talk about these different levels and these different dimensions. And on the evolution science side, the lack of an appreciation for the way that environment and behavior actively up and down regulate genes and are then evolved in phenotypic selection and even in genetic accommodation over time. And the very rise of different species being influenced by things like niche construction or niche selection or genetic accommodation, and those kinds of facts weren't front and center in the evolutionary perspectives that were more, can we say, gene-centric. If you back up just 15, 20 years ago, never mind multi-level selection, but even multi-dimensional.
Everything. Everything. I mean, you're absolutely right that this could not have been written 15 years ago. That's how much has been happening, which on the evolution side falls under the umbrella of the extended evolutionary synthesis. And it's really funny, in my field, there's so much debate about the extended evolutionary synthesis. Is it extended? Is it a synthesis? Is it not a synthesis? There's just like all this angst, even as to what we should call it. But there's no doubt that when you think about these things that are discussed in our volume, they're all taken place within the last 15 or 20 years. Niche construction, multi-level selection, all of these things. And let me focus on language in that regard, because I think that's actually new on both sides. That my understanding of Skinner is that one of the ways that he overreached was by trying to explain language and symbolic thought as something that he could bring, within the umbrella of operant conditioning. And that turned out not to be the case. There needs to be a more extended theory of language, which is one of the things that you, especially, and your colleagues do with relational frame theory. It's at the heart of your therapeutic method. And yet, as far as I could understand, it's actually still a minority view, especially in academic psychology. Not many people that I talk to have heard, I hate to say it, about relational frame theory. And then on the evolutionary side, thinking about symbolic thought from an evolutionary perspective really traces to evolution in 4 dimensions. Eva de Blanca, who is part of our volume, and Marianne Lamb. And then, of course, Terry Deacon's book, The Symbolic Species. He's also part of our volume, proud to say. So really the major thinkers thinking about symbolic thought from an evolutionary perspective are few in number, and we have them.
Yes.
They're talking on your side with people that are newly thinking about language from the CBS side. So this is just new on both sides.
It is, and I think readers will be kind of almost startled by how close some of these perspectives on language are, and their intensely social basis in the form of Terry Deacon's chapter. It's intensely relational basis, but how it's built upon things that are not symbolic and become symbolic in ways that I think are very friendly to RFT. You see that also in the dialogue involving Eva. And so that is very hopeful, because I think what it suggests is that as these fields evolve themselves and begin to see the need to fill in some blanks, they're actually coming closer. And so, the problem with the Skinnerian tradition, the animal learning tradition, was they had their hands on principles that are, Eva argues, 500 million years old. They go back to the Cambrian, and they were, very, very important in the development of the Cambrian explosion and so on. Organisms that evolved earlier don't do operant and classical conditioning. Those that evolved later uniformly do. And yet what you and I are doing right now, arguably, is hundreds of thousands or maybe a couple million years old. That's almost certainly not older than that, because we have a very difficult time after many, many years of trying to get clear evidence that even the cross-fostered chimpanzees and so forth are really doing something fundamentally similar to what's going on with a human infant, let's say. And so that is bringing our field together, because I think evolution science knows if cells are systems for turning environment and behavior into biology, if that's what they are, then you have to have behavioral science brought at the core in a different way than simply what the behavioral biologists have done historically, and especially this issue of language cries out for an analysis that's careful. It's not, simply saying, "Oh, humans are different" or something, but it is systematic and careful. And conversely, on the behavioral side, I think you're exactly right. I think we have to, as we mature, begin to be more sophisticated about the multidimensional nature of human beings or other organisms that we're dealing with, and that involves genetic and epigenetic and cultural and other factors, not simply those that happen within the lifetime of an individual. So it's a point of growth for both of us, both of our fields.
Well, let's focus on some of the things that differences that remain. Some of the biggest gaps, basically, that despite this effort reveals, that are gaps that still need to be closed. Would you like to begin with that, or would you like me to begin?
Why don't you begin with one, and then I'll raise one. We'll do a little counterpoint about things that we see from our respective sides as to areas that we might note or differences, and maybe areas where additional growth and dialogue and so forth will be helpful.
Okay, well, as you know, because we've written about it together in our own Evolving the Future article, there's a lot of mileage you can get out of thinking of the behavioral system as like the immune system, with both an innate component and an adaptive component. The innate component is genetically evolved. It's what we call closed phenotypic plasticity. Plan A, Plan B, Plan C, which are triggered by environmental stimuli. The adaptive component is open-ended, like the antibodies. Some kind of variation in selection process which can evolve behaviors that never existed before in the past. And so in many ways, the Skinnerian tradition represents the adaptive side. The evolutionary psychology tradition represents the innate side. And the great mistake is to argue them against each other, when in fact they both coexist and they interact with each other. And I think that was apparent in the dialogues. And often it was the case that the evolutionists were emphasizing closed forms of phenotypic plasticity, and also genetic differences, such as individual differences in personality, which are either genetic or developmental in a way that more or less results in differences that are unlikely to change, and you wouldn't necessarily want them to change because they're adaptive in their own context. And then on the CBS side, it was, I would say, to use a term that you guys don't like, a little bit blank slate-ish, basically. That everyone has.
You're hurting me, David. You're hurting me. I thought you were going to say black box. At least you said blank slate. Everyone has flexibility, or actually can obtain flexibility. So on the CBS side, flexibility is like good. And on the evolutionary side, I love the metaphor that Renee Duckworth used with a skeleton. So in order to be flexible, we need a skeleton, but a skeleton is inflexible. And so flexibility and inflexibility kind of go hand in hand and must. So what does it mean if people have different skeletons? And they're all flexible and inflexible in their own way. Shouldn't that be reflected in therapy? Shouldn't there be a version of ACT for people with slow life history strategies, and another version for fast? Maybe a version for introverts and another version for extroverts? Why aren't these individual differences on the innate side reflected in? So that's something that I never thought about until actually going through these interviews, but I regard it as fascinating. Well, I think it's a good point, and you do want to put it in context, though, that the behavioral folks, many of them are applied people, and they're trying to be of help to folks. And there's been such a long history of personality types and levels of intellect, or and sometimes historically even very unattractive things, gender, race, etc., being said to be forms of structure that can't be modified, and you have to just accommodate to them. And then turns out that with a clever enough work, that's only partially true, or sometimes not true at all. One at a time. You have over and over again these things where variation is not possible because turns out to be, no, you just haven't looked broad enough at the larger context. And the task is, of course, of one of helping people. So you want to come in with that open set. But I take your point, and I think it's a good one. And it's one that we really need. You can sort of see the future is going to unfold in such a way to keep these things in balance, because these different emphases are the blind men with the elephant kind of situation, and they have their hands on things that are real and important. But then you need to figure out a way how to integrate them properly. Within your field, you've certainly seen the same thing with the Evo-Devo impact in areas in which, development itself was sometimes dismissed. And we're just part of the life cycle of genes. The only thing we need to really focus on is sequences and nucleotides. And you mentioned earlier some of the changes that are going on, but I just read this dialogue with Eva Jablonka, in which they're challenging methylation as, oh, maybe that's just let's say we have a fifth nucleotide. I mean, so there's an effort to hang on to what was, and yet the growth is going to happen in what will be. And I think you have your finger on one that is one. These issues that are either deeply developmental, like attachment style and things like that, or genetic, or have to really be looked at carefully. At the same time, we have to remember, you take something like genetics. If you meditate for 8 weeks, following Herb Benson's protocol, about 8% of your genes will be systematically up and down regulated.
Yeah.
Now you think about something like that, and you go, oh my God, 8% of your freaking body, the command instructions for every cell in your body are changing by 1 hour a week. I mean, what are you talking? So what we're doing right now, as we open up to all these different ways that genes are up and down regulated, we may come to find, for example, that something that we really thought was genetic and is modifiable through extraordinary environments we haven't even thought of yet.
Well, also, I find myself thinking along this path that actually acceptance and commitment training does accommodate individual differences for the people that go through it, because as they reflect upon their values, individual differences will be reflected there. As they reflect upon obstacles, individual differences will be reflected there. And so it's actually can be the case that a single regime of training / therapy can accommodate individual differences in a way that is benign, because it is so centered on the person and their aspirations and so on and so forth. The shy person, the fast life history person, or so on, whoever they are, this is going to be, their individual differences can be accommodated by the method because it's reflective, it's respectful of their own aspirations. It's not imposing somebody else's aspirations.
Well, now there is something that I think you really do get into a different strategy that are in some different wings of behavioral science. And the contextual behavioral science wing comes out of a tradition of getting these high precision, high scope, high depth principles, and then individual by individual, trying to fit the principles to the particular history and needs of that individual. So, and the same thing happened in the history of the development of the applied wing of CBS. The RFT is way up at 35,000 feet. And it's not English versus French or something like that. It's trying to get at the level of what are the really basic principles involved in symbolic thought at all. And then how that is fitted to the individual is a matter of the individual cultural and personal interests of. And so, for example, psychological flexibility, that concept has been looked at now in something like 18 different language communities. So far, in every single one, the relationship to the health outcome is basically identical. And in all, except for one language we've tapped into, even the factor analyses of the instruments are identical. And so you have to say, okay, well, yes, if you're in Japan, let's say, you don't use I, you use something more like we, they. Yes, if you're in Africa, you think of values in a very different way than if you're raised in New England. But maybe we can get principles in the same way that evolution science principles push to these high levels of abstraction that allow us to fit an analysis to the needs of the community, the individual, the family, et cetera. And that's an exciting way to think about how evolution science itself might move. Because if I could raise something on my side that I saw in the various dialogues, we're used to, on the behavioral side, thinking of vetting the value of our theories, models, and principles against our ability to predict and influence with precision, scope, and depth the phenomena of interest. On the evolution science side, that and influence part has not been in there historically. It's a science of influence over a long time frame, but it's not necessarily in the hands of the individual who understands it an obligation to show that your analysis can lead to an ability to influence. And so when I had a bit of frustration in some of the teams of thinking of this, okay, here's an analysis that's really nice, I understand it, but if that's true, shouldn't you be able to do this with those people, these people here that are within the scope of your analysis, and get this to happen? Shouldn't it be tested that way? And it's not in the evolution science tradition to do it. There is not a robust, there is an applied evolution science wing, but it doesn't view itself as fundamental to the testing of the adequacy of this way of speaking about the phenomenon. That my sense is. It's more like an adjunct or something you would hope to see, but relatively unimportant. Very much the way you might think, if I really understand this disease, eventually I might be able to get a medication for it or something, but it's not really up to me, it's my understanding. Over on our side, our understanding means being able to influence it. That's the kind of goals we have. And so, do you share my view that for evolution science to really fully come into the cultural conversation, especially in some places like the United States, where practically close to the majority of the people don't even believe evolution is real, we're going to have to figure out a way to square that circle and to put evolutionary thinking into the front of things like the creation of pro-social groups, or helping people out with education, or dealing with psychopathology. And that is something we know about over on the behavioral science side, and might actually be of some use to the evolution science community more broadly as we enter into this reunification.
Right. So all great points. And now let me make a few points in response. One of the things that contextual behavioral science does, tracing back to the tradition of pragmatism, is just question the entire relationship between basic and applied science. And the standard view is that basic science is curiosity-driven. It asks the big questions and might be useful down the road, but utility is not what you keep in mind, basically. You're asking the big questions. And that applied science applies this stuff, but typically isn't very interesting in terms of the big questions. So there's a negative trade-off, imagine, between basic and applied science. Contextual behavioral science turns that around and says basically the best science is the science that's done in context. And that you could be asking the big questions at the very same time that you're actually improving the quality of life. So I think that, as I've said earlier, evolutionary biology has to be contextual in the sense of studying species in relation to their environments. Now, sometimes it doesn't do that. What that means is that field studies, research in the field, needs to be the backbone of evolutionary science, and that all laboratory science needs to be based on field science. And when it doesn't, then the laboratory science is in distinct danger of going off the rails, of basically asking questions and doing experiments, which in fact are very difficult to understand because they're not related to the organism and its context. That whole piece is pretty well understood by evolutionists, although it is still the case that those lab experiments that are disconnected, that's done all the time. But I think that's, in some ways, that's familiar ground for an evolutionary biologist. But again, only in the context of genetic evolution, and then not necessarily in the context of applied ecology, for example. I could have said all that just in the pursuit of basic knowledge without trying to work on ecosystem services or conservation biology or any of those applied sorts of things. So I think as soon as evolutionary biologists do become applied in their interests, and some but not all of our authors did. I mean, you could take people like Bruce Ellis, for example, who's an evolutionary developmental psychologist who is just as much wants to improve outcomes in schools as his counterpart, Kelly Wilson, for example. He's right there trying to do applied work. Or take someone like Eva DeBlanca or Terry Deacon, who are thinking hard about such things as language and learning, but they're basic scientists. There's just not what they do. So I think that there's all of these distinctions to be made. But the concept that there can be a positive trade-off between basic and applied science, and that to understand these things in the real world, can make it better basic science is a very, very important message. Now, to finish up on the CBS side, I think it's because it is so applied, then I think that there's a big bias that's built in there. When you think about our behavioral systems, you can say that, for the most part, they lead to good outcomes without even people trying. It's just that our instincts for behavior and cultural stuff, they basically work pretty well for us, and those are the folks that you don't see. So CBS, by being so applied, is concentrated on a minority of the population for whom what's happened to them has not worked well. And I wonder how much you've thought of that. I'll bet you've thought of it a lot. And what can be done about it? I think, among other things, it calls for the CBS approach on general populations. And that does take place as soon as we apply CBS above the level of the individual to groups and populations. So, for example, our chapter on organizations that pairs Mark Van Vogt with Frank Bond. These are both people that are working in businesses and management. And there you're not dealing with a narrow segment of the population. You're dealing with just groups of people trying to function well as groups. You're less biased in that regard. So anyhow, back to you. What do you think about that?
Yeah, this is a complex set of issues, actually. And one of the things that it actually goes back to how the disconnection happened. Because if you had to pick the single biggest thing that ecologists and evolutionary biologists, et cetera, hated about the animal learning tradition that leads to contextual behavioral science, it was the decontextualization of animal behavior, putting pigeons and rats in boxes and things of that kind. So here, this care about field studies, and when you're going to need to bring things into the lab, but you have to make sure you get the right elements in there. And over here we have an applied tradition which tries to base its work on kind of working in the field. That you're right. I think very often people have problems, but not exclusively. I'll come back to that. But looking for principles that come out of the lab, and really, so the CBS group has a very robust tradition. If you take the RFT work, let's say, I would say probably of the 300 or so, 350 empirical publications on it, probably about 150 or 200 of those are laboratory experiments that are very arcane. They're hard as heck to read. They're kind of stripped of and the idea is you'll get these high precision, high scope principles. It could have been wrong, like Skinner's gamble, that operant classical conditioning could be understood, and you could kind of get to what would go across tips of evolutionary branches that way. It could have been wrong. In fact, you'll find him saying, it's not that this is arbitrary. I'm not assuming that it does. This is just a strategy, because if I get immediately into complexity, I start focusing on all these features of the context, and I miss, what might be these higher scope principles. And it turned out, I think that he got away with it. I mean, principles of, let's say, schedules of reinforcement. I mean, they apply to boa constrictors and spiders and baboons and human beings in very, very similar ways. Except, by the way, when human beings get language, then they really start changing a lot. And you can see that in the developmental history of human beings in terms of how they respond to contingencies of reinforcement. But if I can come back to this other dynamic, in part because the behavioral folks are applied people, they really have to look very carefully at what their individual purposes are. And so if you had to pick a place where the Skinnerian tradition breaks from the behavioral tradition, the Watsonian tradition, it's in a paper where Skinner applies behavioral thinking to himself and says, well, if I do that, I can't go with these prohibitions against looking within. The issue is not within and without, it's how precise are the contingencies controlling my observation as a scientist. If I'm the last person on the planet If I'm Robinson Crusoe, I could do a science of my behavior, including my internal behavior. And the fact that I can't get public agreement is irrelevant. The issue is, can I bring my observation under the control of the events in such a way that I'm able to do predict and control? For example, can I save my water enough that I don't die of thirst, etc.? Well, that overthrew the whole behavioral tradition. And here, when I look at evolutionists, sometimes I think, have you really thought of your own behavior as an evolutionist? Have you thought of your own scientific behavior? Because if you would do that, would you really say, my purpose is just to understand, meaning just to describe and to be able to predict, as opposed to my purpose is to do all that and to be able to interact in and with the world in such a way that this one little dimension called language, that after all is the product of science, the immediate product of science is just words, that though that product would give me the ability to interact more successfully and to alleviate human suffering and promote prosperity, and it doesn't seem as though the evolutionists often have thought about it. The behavioral folks have thought about it deeply, and it's been important, and at least the contextual behavioral folks, it's been important in the development of their particular field. And if they know it, they know that well. You and I have had some conversations like this, walking around the lakes and Binghamton and so forth, and visiting your treehouse and other wonderful journeys. And I'd be interested in your thoughts of it. I mean, of course, scientific goals are up to the scientist. You can't say your goals should be my goals. But it's not that the goals are different. It's that sometimes it seems as though there's been a just automatic assumption that, basic understanding is what our goal is. And if it leads to application, that would be nice, as opposed to I'm a behaving organism, behaving in and with the world, including my discipline. What is the selection criteria that I want to put on my scientific behavior? And if somebody did that and then said, here's the selection criteria, and they just want to stand behind it, fine. If they haven't thought about it, then I wonder, what's up with that? Why haven't you thought about it? If you're an evolutionist, isn't selection important? What's selecting your behavior as a scientist?
Well, that's we have to remember that the evolutionists that we selected for our volume are a very rare breed. And for the most part, this apartheid between evolutionary biology and all of the human-related sciences, just applying evolution to human affairs, which became taboo for most of the 20th century, was respected on both sides. So, and evolutionary biologists who think clearly about their particular organisms are just get sweaty palms when they're asked to apply that to humans. They just don't go there. And it's not a principle, they didn't think much about it. It's just a boundary that they respect, and they're just not going to barge through that door with the no trespassing sign. So I think that
I'm glad you raised that, and I know you've thought about this and written about it deeply, and I think it's exactly right. But here's the thing I just want to put in the room. When behavior analysis and behavioral modification first came on this on the cultural screen, which happened in the 60s, as we began to realize that we could actually do some things with these animal learning principles, and there were these very bold visions, of Walden 2 and things like that written that were kind of provocative. They weren't declaring, I don't think, an answer, but just like, wouldn't we want to be able to do this? More of an aspiration. If you look at the history of that time, within just a few years, you have Clockwork Orange. You have people saying that in a single sentence, writing scholarly articles in the New York Times, as reporters do, equating behavior modification with psychosurgery. And if you read the sentences, the next sentence coming, eugenics, the Nazis. And so the functional contextual perspectives that we represent, each in our different ways and at different levels, have both been put into a bowl and been held to account for things like psychosurgery or overt racism, sometimes with some hand waving to Mendel. And that has done a tremendous damage to the culture and to the science. And we kind of, I think, both to some degree withdrew. I do have to say, I think the behavioral science folks have learned how to move forward, and the way we've done it is by hanging on to things like clinical work, where an individual is suffering and you can do something about it. And you're not running out there saying we're going to redesign the schools or something, not first, not primary, not your front face. Your front face to the culture is, if you have a sister with an addiction problem, give us a call. If you have a child who can't learn and is not acquiring a language, give us a call. You know, if you can't get up in the morning without thinking about imminent panic attacks, give us a call. That formula brought behavioral thinking back into the culture from the Clockwork Orange era 50 years ago to where now the government is listing us on the evidence-based procedures that they want to see implemented in healthcare systems. There's not something like that on the evolution side, at least in the US. There is in some very progressive countries. You can find it in things like Norway, and you've been involved with it. But I wonder, here's what I'm saying. I think we have a common fate. And I think the behavioral scientists have shown how to do it, but to this day, we are very cautious about talking about large-scale cultural change, things that might be able to be engineered in our schools, societies, businesses, etc. And part of the dark shadow out there is the one that you have to face in your side. So I'm not sure either one of us is going to be able to do what we came here to do in the promotion of human well-being if we don't solve this problem of the horror of Nazism and some of the misuse of these principles on both sides.
Well, okay, here we go. It's ironic that there are these two histories of, I want to say, scaremongering. One on behaviorism, as you just recounted, that this is going to lead to eugenics and Nazis and all of this kind of thing. And for evolution, social Darwinism, that if we are Darwinists, so if we're Skinnerians, we're going to do mind control and it's going to go to eugenics and Nazis. And if we're Darwinists, it's going to lead to mind control and we're going
Exactly.
And so I have looked, it's one of the things I'm proud of over the last couple of years, is to look at the social Darwinism issue in great detail and to have published with Eric Michael Johnson a special edition of This View of Life called Truth and Reconciliation for Social Darwinism, which actually goes through this, this history. And if we were to do the same for scaremongering about behaviorism, it would be very, very similar. Basically, these are bogeyman stories, which are told by intellectuals. It's very, very sad that in the human-related disciplines, you have two things going on side by side. You have great scholarship, which actually anyone who wants to consult will tell you that evolutionary theory, Darwin's theory, did not lead to Pandora's box being open. Hitler was not influenced by Darwin, quite the contrary. You get people like Dewey, who was. Is he called a social Darwinist? No. So it goes on and on like this. Just good scholarship existing side by side with this crap, bogeyman stories, and all of this can be revealed. the same thing, the same story could be told for Bogeyman stories coexisting with good scholarship about behaviorism. At the end of the day, what you have to do is some clear thinking about the application of scientific knowledge of all sorts to public policy, basically, to efforts to make the world better. When does it become insidious, and when does it become benign? But here are the things that we know. First of all, doing nothing won't work. Forget about it. So we have to do something. Everyone should agree with that. And of course, we need to draw upon some form of knowledge in order to do something. Is science useful in this regard? Well, of course it is. So how do we make it benign and keep it from being insidious? It becomes insidious when it involves people manipulating other people. When I impose what I think is best on you, that's insidious. But if we agree that this is something that we want to do, or if it's just an individual who agrees that they're in a bad way and they want to do something, then of course that is more likely to be benign. Not certain to be benign, but more likely to be benign. So some clear thinking on, and it comes down to basically egalitarianism, basically. Making decisions by consensus, what we want to do, is likely to be benign as opposed to various forms of manipulation and exploitation. You know, this is so simple in retrospect that, and knowledge will always be provisional. So you don't wait until something is rock solid before you apply it. I have a little essay called Fear of Knowledge, which is on this, and I'll provide a link to it. So the bottom line is that there's some very general issues about the relationship between basic and applied science, how to apply knowledge in a way which is likely to be benign and which is protected against various forms of exploitation and so on and so forth, which are just bedrock for all kinds of policy formation. And it's a shame that that work has to be done to prepare the way for us to basically do our work. But it's part of the groundwork that that is needed and which is in progress.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think just the intellectual piece of showing that it's certainly a distortion and an exaggeration to sort of make these connections on both sides it's important, but I don't think it's enough. For one thing is that they're not completely divorced. You can certainly find very racist things being said, for example, by early evolutionists. Why wouldn't they? The whole culture was racist. I mean, and it's really not fair. But I mean, you can find Darwin talking about some surprise about the Maori, or you can find certainly others saying some things which are very so that's on the one hand. So you can't completely solve it that way. But I think we're actually there's in accordance here. One of the things that, as a applied person, a clinician, is that if you're going to work with somebody, you're going to have to work with them within their values, their purposes, their goals. And there's on the ACT side of things, as you mentioned earlier, a whole technology about how to do that and do that in a way that's not imposing your values on others. You're always free to withdraw. You can respectfully decline to help somebody towards something that you really think is not pro-social, and that occasionally might even happen. But usually, you come to an agreement about what it is you're trying to do. But what that tells me is this, goes back to the point I'm making earlier, is that evolutionary theory will never fully enter into the culture in a way that fits what it can bring to the culture until it's able to do it as its natural applied extension. And people understand that the way that's done is egalitarian and respectful of their purposes and goals. And we have seen this in the project that we're working on together, Pro-Social, which is talked about in the pair of chapters here in the small groups section of the volume, in which here we have this descriptive set of principles that are evolutionarily sensible, coming out of the Nobel Prize winning work of Lynn Ostrom, the core design principles. And yet when we come to wanting to apply that to pro-social groups, we find that we need to go through a conversation about the individual and group values and the things that get in the way, so that people can see this not as an imposition of a structure on top of them, but more as an empowerment of their interests and what they're trying to do together as a group. And I think that gives a little template for how this reunification might work, is that we're looking at different parts of the elephant and we emphasize different things, and each of us are evolving in ways, each field in ways that will be more comprehensive in terms of the other. But in the places where we overlap, we can bring some of these differences together, and then as an applied matter, be able to apply principles drawn from both levels to help social development around the world in areas like education, pro-social groups, and so forth. And that does put us in contact with, as you say, not just people who are clinically in need, but people for prevention issues or development issues that are more normal range. And I think as the culture understands that, if they start looking to David Sloan Wilson for help in, designing their parks or in working with their regulations about fair labor practices, or and it's proven by benefit within the values of. I think that the view is going to change.
So thank you, first of all, and I think that it's going to surprise a lot of people that evolutionary theory, how much it weighs in on an affirmative way, by showing that for any group to work well, no matter what its size, there has to be a balance of power among its constituents. And as soon as you have an imbalance of power, then decisions will be made, and cultural evolution will take the form of privileging those with the power. And so balance of power is everything at all scales. So that's the evolutionary message, not what people associate with social Darwinism. And if you go back to even the 1950s, there's a good social history of behaviorism, and I'll remember the link and we'll provide it, that recounts this history. And one of the things it shows, and which those of us that are old enough can actually remember it, is the attitudes towards the state back then was so much more trusting. It's as if the job of the scientist was to produce knowledge, and then it was the job of the politician to wisely apply that knowledge to the polity. We would trust them to do that, and even to do it to the point where they would have the right to make decisions such as who can reproduce or not, and so on and so forth. The state was wise enough and trustworthy enough to do that. That was in the bones. You don't have to go back to Victorian culture to see that. All you have to go back is to the mid-20th century culture to see how much trust we placed in our leaders. Well, not anymore. And
yeah.
So it's for that reason that some of these injustices did take place. Not that they followed from behaviorism, not that they followed from social Darwinism, but because they followed from the imbalance of power.
Yeah.
This is. I
agree. And multi-level selection points to it. I have to say, as a person out of the behavioral tradition, Skinner wrote extensively about the importance of counter control. Of that you have to keep the people who are being influenced in a position where they in turn can influence, or you get this kind of authoritarian kind of output. And so, I thought as a student that understanding behavioral principles was a matter of empowering people who were disempowered by the system. I came to psychology as an environmental activist before I was involved in psychology, and I saw up close and personal some of the things that have led to the cynicism, such as the ability of, let's say, oil companies in California to use politicians to get regulations that were very favorable to them, but do it in such a way that the citizens didn't realize that they're being had. And it seemed to me that understanding kind of principles of behavior would give people that capacity for counter control. How do we influence the behavior of organisms and systems and politicians and so forth? I'm proud of the fact, if I can just mention something, it might seem like a non sequitur, but when ACT first hit the scene and became popular, and after Time wrote it up in 2006, the early criticisms were, this acceptance is just teaching the downtrodden to accept their fate because the people in power are to. Okay, well, my response respectfully was, well, the first randomized trial in the modern era after this long development history, we did early work in the 80s, and then it wasn't until the 2000s that we started putting the results of that work on RFT and all the rest out, was done by Frank Bond, the person you've already mentioned, in which he went into a call center and did work on the psychological flexibility of these workers who are having to work in very difficult environments, very stressful, almost piecework, like
one of the worst jobs you could have.
And here's what happened. You did that individual work, and the workers started demanding change in their work environments. Because what was keeping them from going to the foreperson and saying, this is really not right, we need to take these because this is unnecessary and this would be better, was this emotional fear of, will I be approved of, etc. And some of it's real, of course, you could, but sometimes in environments that actually you're not going to be fired, you need to give voice. It's a little scary, you can do it. And so we had evidence from the very, very first trial that it wasn't like that. Acceptance as a word can mean accept your situation and your behavior. But that's not what acceptance is about in ACT. It's about accepting your history, focusing on your values, and changing your situation and behavior to better foster your own prosperity and development. And that's in fact what's happened as we've implemented. It's one reason why we put some of those methods into pro-social.
Yeah. So this might be a good high note to end on, Steve, that if you look at what we're doing, what we and our brethren are doing, is manifestly pro-social, basically. And it attempts to be pro-social at all scales. A lot of this began at the individual scale, but it's working up to the worldwide scale. If you take our friend Tony Biglum, who was the one who introduced us to each other, then he's currently working on more nurturing forms of capitalism. He's showing that capitalism isn't bad. Capitalism is like rapid cultural evolution is what it is, but it's taking place in an environment that's causing it to run amok. And so we have all these problems. We have the gun industry, we have the drug industry, we have the pharmaceutical industry. We have all these things, basically, as selection by consequences writ large, people being reinforced for what they're doing, but the systemic outcome is not what we want. And so therefore we have to tune the parameters so that these powerful forces of cultural evolution actually lead to pro-social outcomes at all scales, from the individual to the small group, all the way up to the planet Earth. So basically what we've done is we've taken a pro-social agenda, an agenda that nobody could disagree with, because it strives for basically a sustainable Earth and sustainable and everything else in line with that. So that would be hard to disagree with. And then it trains the science to that end. And as far as we're concerned, if anyone were to try to train the science towards antisocial ends, which of course happens all the time because groups are often in conflict with each other, then we stand against that. So I think that we've taken a moral position, and we're harnessing that to the science, which I think makes it difficult to criticize on the basis that this is likely to lead to immoral outcomes. We're here to make sure that doesn't happen. So I think this is an alignment of ideas that I think is going to solve some of the problems that existed in the past, where people associated the science with immoral outcomes, basically.
No, I think that is a good place to end, and it goes back to that issue of what are the selection criteria, and those are our responsibility. And as scientists, I don't think we should be ashamed of saying that part of what we're interested in is the development of knowledge that has a pro-social impact. That doesn't mean that you don't play science the way science is played. That kabuki dance has been well developed, but the purpose of playing the game that way isn't to reach a particular formulation about how to impact the world in a pro-social way, but that you intend to develop knowledge that can be vetted against our criterion, I think, is something which is entirely within our prerogative as human beings to say, this is what we want to do with our careers and with this wonderful tool of science, which is which may be in an abstract sense values free, but in the lives of scientists and of the consumers of scientific knowledge is anything but. And I think we need a science even of that and of the values of human beings and how they can be put into the world. And that's part of what we're trying to work out together, I think, is how to develop that kind of knowledge that walks the line and stays in balance, does high quality work at all these different levels and in different dimensions, and yet can be held to account for the moral status of the enterprise. And I think people reading the volume will see that dynamic and the attempt to produce a reunification that would pass through that level of scrutiny.
Okay, well said. You had the last word.